So I debated whether or not to put a recap in, but I decided to. Um, Even though for many of you, you'll be finishing up part 2 of the lecture this week as well. So um, whatever, I thought it'd be helpful to have a lecture review. If you're, super sharp on this, skip it, but I think it's helpful. So this is a recap from lecture 4, part 1, where we talked about supply and demand as a whole. Okay, so supply relates to quantity produced, aka supply to quantity supplied for every price, excuse me. So it's a function, right? Supply is a function where you have P on one side, P equals mx, or m, some slope, Q, your quantity supplied, plus B, some intercept, okay? So it's a function relating quantity produced or quantity supplied for every price, okay? Demand is also a function relating some quantity consumed, a demand, quantity demanded, for every price. Okay, so at price equals 5, 6 hot dogs are going to be demanded. Okay, and if at price equals 5, 6 hot dogs are going to be supplied, then you have a match. Okay, so you can't say supply without having an underlying price quantity relationship. Okay, there is no supply without price quantity relationship. Okay, it's a function. That's important. It's a function. All right. So we defined a market economy. We'll slither back to supply and demand later, but I use it in the coming bullet points a little bit, so I wanted to define them first. But a market economy is one where producers or suppliers and consumers, aka demanders, meet to exchange goods at an agreed upon price. So imagine you have people on a stock market floor and someone's got a ticket and it says, I want Amazon, I want Amazon, I want Amazon. I'll accept any price I'm willing to pay up to, $150 a share. I don't know what Amazon's trading at, but, and you have a corresponding supplier who's got shares of Amazon that they're willing to sell, and they're willing to sell it at anything above 120. So you have, let's say, 10 shares here wanting to be bought and 8 shares here wanting to be sold. And they'll agree on some price between 120 and 150, the willingness to pay and the willingness to sell. And that'll be the agreed upon price and quantity sold. So because he's willing to sell at 120, he'll probably sell all 8 for somewhere between 120 and 150, probably closer to 150 since, there's excess demand, but you don't have to worry about that. But they agree on some sort of price and some quantity sold for, basically a kind of auction. That's a market. It's a group of people who want to buy things and a group of people who want to sell things coming together, agreeing on a price, and then, going their separate ways. That's a market. In contrast, the command economy is one where a government determines price and output. So there'll be a coal mine, and let's say we need 5,000 units of coal to ship to this, particular factory so that they can produce 300 units of missiles or something like that. So everything's predetermined by the government. They determine the quantity. They determine the worker's salary. If the worker comes up short, they might be penalized, but probably they won't be fired in some sense. They might be scolded or something like that. But the worker has really no incentive to go above the target, except maybe political incentive. But the average worker is not going to see that. But at any rate, so the whole command economy works basically the same way that like a military would, where you're kind of told what to do and you do it. And if you do it well, you get a pat on the back, but you're not seeing a bonus. It's all set by some sort of leader in charge or leaders in charge, not by an underlying market where price can act as a signal, and that'll be one of the next points. But if the command economy overshoots what's actually demanded, then you'll have a lot of excess goods that if they expire, and probably more likely, if it undershoots the production targets, then you'll have a lot of people who want to buy a good and are willing to pay for the good, but can't get it. And that was one of the bigger problems with command economies. So workers didn't really have any incentive to increase their production outside of maybe some political incentive, which they could just lie about. And they're tended towards shortages in command economies. And you see this if you guys do the Commanding Heights extra credit, you'll see this. They go through a few different command economies in India, in the Soviet Union, in Poland, Argentina, Chile, or I don't think they do Argentina actually, Chile, Bolivia, India, if I haven't said it. But they go through a few different command economies with, some are more or less command, some are slightly command, slightly market, or somewhere in between. And they show you, particularly in the Soviet Union, why these didn't meet the needs for people in the Soviet Union at the time. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, I highly suggest you watch the Commanding Heights, even if you don't do the extra credit, which wouldn't make sense because it's a 2-hour long documentary and it's really easy to do the extra credit. But even if you're too late on the extra credit, watch the Commanding Heights, especially part 2, because that's where it gets really interesting to me. Part 1's awesome too. Don't get me wrong. Part 2's great, and part 3's great too. They're all great. Anyway, so if you're interested in the history of that, watch the Commanding Heights because it's great. Anyway, let's move on to the next bullet point. So going back to markets, in a market, price acts as a signal to a potential producer or consumer that they should enter or leave the market. So if you know that the price is above your willingness to pay, so the price of a jet is way above my pay grade, so I'm never going to enter a market and think, I can buy a jet. And if I'm a supplier or let's say it's me, and I know that jets are making a ton of money, but I'm well above, way less money than it would cost me to learn how to make a jet, buy the raw materials, test it, and eventually produce a final good. If it's above my expected cost, I know that I'm not going to make money entering the jet market, so I'm going to stay out of it. So price is like a signal. It's a means to tell a potential producer or consumer whether or not it makes sense to enter the market. If the price is above your willingness to pay, or if it's below your opportunity cost or your and your explicit cost, your total economic cost, then you as a consumer or producer won't want to enter that market. And it's pretty instantaneous, right? So it happens without some sort of central planner, and it happens across the globe pretty quickly. So, if you're thinking about the stock market, even though sometimes there'll be irrationalities in price because people's individual willingness to pay might be higher than they should be or lower than they should be or something like that, it does provide a signal for is the market how is the market viewing this particular good. So if you're looking to buy Amazon stock because you think in 10 years it'll be worth double, you as a consumer might say, okay, I'm willing to pay double for Amazon stock, so I'm going to buy it today, relative to the time value of money, relative to what I the opportunity cost of my money, basically. So I'm willing to pay like maybe 1.5 times and expect it to be double in 10 years. And then I'll make 50% gains on that, 50% profit. So that'll be like a signal. And if everybody's thinking like that, right, the price of Amazon's going to increase such that you might want to be like double thinking it. Like, okay, if it increases to 1.5 times if it increases to where you think it'll be in 10 years, then you know you're not going to buy it. And markets kind of react that way. If you think that something's going to be increase in a month, chances are a lot of people are thinking like that, and you'll see that the price will increase before maybe you have a chance to buy it. So like individual fluctuations in the stock market are actually a pretty good predictor of where the economy will be in a few months. They call it a leading economic indicator. And the reason being is that it's like a signal. The price is a signal of where, the price of a stock will be a signal for where you think that that company will be trading at in a month or 2 months or a year or whatever your time horizon is. So if you think that the price is above, where the price now is above where you think it'll be in 5 years, that'll be your signal not to buy it. Okay. Also, wages is a form of price. So if you're thinking of like a particular job market, let's say you want to be an engineer and you see that the wages are really high, you might want to enter, you might want to like go study engineering, also relative to your opportunity cost and your explicit cost, the total economic cost. So if the wages for engineering are way higher than they are for any other field, and it's not that costly to become an engineer, you'll have a lot of college students who want to become an engineer. That's basically your signal, like, hey, the wages are really high. That means that there's not enough supply of engineers to meet the demand. So I'm going to enter the engineering market. What does that do? Then, if enough people enter, the competition for engineers is going to be a little bit thicker, like over time. So eventually what you'll see is you as the engineering company is going to look at your resume and they're going to see, okay, I have 5 resumes lined up. They're all, pretty much the same. Let's see who get it for the lowest wage. So, it starts with wages being high because there's not enough supply of engineers. Then the supply of engineers comes to meet that, and then the wages drop down. That's your signal, okay, maybe I should consider a different field. But if you think that wages are going to stay high for significant enough time, then you would become an engineer. Okay. So I just have a little bullet point there, sub-bullet point. If there's more supply than demanded, then the price will go down and producers will leave the market. So like I said, if eventually, too many engineers enter, the wages are going to drop down significantly such that, people who are not really enjoying being an engineer, they see a higher opportunity cost of being an engineer. They could go be an economist, for instance. They'll leave engineering and they might become an economist. Of course, in the real world, because you need a college degree for most things, it's very costly to switch fields, and maybe that's where the next economic policy should be is reducing transition costs or switching costs for fields. It'd be a very beneficial thing if you can figure that one out. So given the relative supply and demand, the number of buyers and sellers in a particular market, there's different ways to categorize that market. So I went through different examples, and I don't expect you to memorize the names just yet. You'll see them again in the third part of the course towards the end. But just to go over them real quick. When there's a lot of sellers, we call that perfect competition, and they don't have any real influence over the price. When there's not a lot of sellers, when there's just one seller, we call it monopoly. That's when there's one seller, mono one. and they have complete control over the price. They can set whatever price that they so please. They can set a price so high that they don't sell anything if they wanted to. When there's only a few producers, so 3 or 4, 10 or something like that, we'll call that oligopoly. When there's a lot of producers, but they're producing something slightly different, so you're not really in perfect competition, but you're also not a monopoly. So like you're selling, jeans or something like that, where, Lucky brand jeans will be a little bit different than Jinko brand jeans. It's going way back to the 90s, which will be a little bit different from Aeropostale or Urban Outfitters jeans. All of them are a little bit different, but, if one of them tried to raise the prices so high, the way that a monopoly would, they'd be, they wouldn't be selling anything at all. So there's still definitely price competition there, but it's not quite as strict as perfect competition, where if you raise the price a cent, you're going to lose all your market. So we call that monopolistic competition. Okay, and then there was also monopsony, which is a case where you only have one buyer, so consider like a government contract is typically the example of monopsony, where the government will say, I want to buy a nuclear weapon. It's not like the average person can go about buying nuclear weapons, but the government say, I want to buy a nuclear weapon. Here's the contract. Produce it for me. So again, perfect competition when there's a lot of sellers. They can't influence the price at all. Then you have monopolistic competition when there's a lot of sellers, but they have a little bit of differentiated products, so they can change the price, but not too much. Then you have oligopoly when there's only a few sellers, and then monopoly when there's only one seller. An oligopoly can behave strategically depending on how their price influences the other, let's say 3 or 4 people in the economy's 3 or 4 producers' prices. And the monopolists can price whatever they so choose. And the monopsony is based on buyers. Okay, so there are different ways to categorize markets based on the number of buyers and sellers, and this becomes important in that that'll determine basically the market power that individual buyers and sellers have. So if there's a lot of engineers in a market, if there's a lot of producers of engineering feats or engineering work, then the individual engineer won't have a whole lot of power in that market. And essentially, this is that'll lead into what we're talking about today, which is consumer and producer surplus. So if you're the producer of engineering work, if you're the engineer, and there's a ton of you, you're going to have what's called low producer surplus. Okay, so markets and the number of buyers and sellers in it are very important. Okay, so going back to supply and demand as a concept, if I know what consumers are willing to pay, so I have a survey out there, and I'm saying, okay, John's willing to pay 5, Alex is willing to pay 6, Jody's willing to pay 7, and I write them all down, and then what I can do is I can create a demand schedule. And we did this last week when we did Joe, Jack, and John. So we take these willingness to pays as a given. Oh, sorry, this is really small. We take the willingness to pays as a given. That's just based on individual preferences. It's not something that we have to figure out. It's not something that we can figure out. It's just basically a survey, the data that you're given. But from these willingness to pays, we can see how many hot dogs each person will be willing to buy, get for a particular price at a particular price point. And then we can construct what's called a demand schedule, which relates the price of a particular good to the quantity demanded of that good. And then the demand schedule, if you write that out in a graph, is your demand. That is your demand function. And that is somewhere down here. So this little yellow line is just the plotted demand function. Okay. And again, demand is just a price-quantity relationship, the relationship between your price and your quantity demanded. Okay. And then if you do the same thing with producer cost, in particular their marginal cost, which is the cost of the next additional unit, you can create a supply schedule. So we did the same thing with Dietz and Watson, where we took their cost as given, okay, their marginal cost as given, and we plotted based on each price point how many hot dogs they'd be willing to produce, and that led to this this supply function. Okay. My mouse, there it is. Okay, so based on the signals received, people are going to enter and leave markets until they basically reach this settling point. And we call this settling point equilibrium. I was about to say economics. We call this settling point equilibrium. Okay, so at equilibrium, all the buyers and sellers basically agree on one price and one set of quantity supplied and quantity demanded, which are equal to each other. So basically, if you know that there's going to be 50 buyers and 50 sellers, and the willingness to pay is above the cost for those guys, they're going to meet it somewhere in between, and that'll be your equilibrium price. And I kind of showed you using the graph here why it didn't make sense to deviate from the equilibrium price. So let's say you were this producer, and you wanted to sell to this guy, right? So this producer, the one at 5.4, has a lower cost than this person's willingness to pay. So theoretically, they could trade, and both people would be better off. But there are a bunch of other people with whom this person would rather trade, because he can basically sell the same good at a higher price to these guys than he can for these guys, because these guys have a higher willingness to pay. So if he were to charge a price below the equilibrium price, he'd be kind of doing himself a disservice. Okay. And if you wanted to increase the quantity, we could increase it to here. And eventually, like if you increase it to here, basically you're saying this guy's cost is higher than the next guy's willingness to pay. So why would this guy want to sell it at a loss? So the market will eventually tend to somewhere around here where the highest willingness to pay people are getting the good, and the lowest cost people are selling the good, and they're getting it so that they can basically increase the difference between their cost and the price if you're a supplier, or the price and the willingness to pay if you're a producer, if you're a consumer or the demander, right? So you want to get the lowest price if you're relative to your willingness to pay if you're if you're part of the demand equation, and if you're part of the suppliers, you want to get the highest price relative to your cost. And we'll show you why, and I'll show you why. I don't know why I said we. I'll show you why in a little bit when we talk about consumer and producer surplus. But basically, it doesn't make sense to deviate, because if you're one of these suppliers on the left-hand side, you could always make more money selling to one of the demanders on the left-hand side than you could selling to one of the lower willingness to pay demanders. And same thing, if you're one of the demanders here, you'd rather buy it from a low-cost producer than a high-cost producer, because somewhere in between is going to be the price. Okay, and you want to maximize the difference between your willingness to pay and the price you pay. Right? You don't want to pay more than you have to. So based on the signals received, eventually markets will tend to a price at which the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are the same. So, if you're going back to the engineering example, if the wages start off high and more people enter, then the wages will drop and people will leave, and this dynamic will work until basically the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied are like their long run settling point, and that point will be equilibrium. All right. continuing on with the recap, I wanted to break this out into two slides just because the second one gets a little bit it's got a lot of words in it. So I'm going to stop the lecture here for a second just because it's going on for 25 minutes, and we'll continue on with recap part 2.